Hey everybody, my name is Joshua May and I'm the CEO of Reventure Companies. And with me this evening I have Dr. Carol Lynn George. Known Carol for a long time, and she is not only the former science advisor of the state of Utah, but also is the CEO of 32 ATPs. Am I saying that right, Carol?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And folks, if you are having trouble getting on here this evening, I apologize for that. Carol and I ran into some issues ourselves as we were getting set up this afternoon. Google has changed some things, and they're not interfaced with YouTube the way they were before. So you're going to be able to check us out right on the Adventure Media page, and you're actually going to be able to ask questions right on there. You no longer need to go to YouTube. And as a matter of fact, I don't think you can ask questions from YouTube anymore. So those instructions that I gave were poor, and I apologize for that. Just real quick to let you know, some of you may know that we used to do a pretty popular series for entrepreneurs, Hangouts, based around a couple of businesses that we had done in the past. And when we started Reventure, I wanted to bring this back and start conversations on some important topics. And most of the time, we're probably going to be focusing on things such as climate, energy, and the environment. But this is a topic that is causing a lot of stir, and a lot of people are very concerned about. And I think myself and many others don't really have a grasp on it. That is where Dr. George comes in. So we'll be spending about an hour, hour and a half tonight, and then we'll be having one of these about every 2 weeks. Without further ado, what I'm going to do is just let Carol talk a little bit about what she's done in the past, what's brought her to this point, and then we'll start talking about the topic of the night.
Great. So like Josh mentioned, I am the former state science advisor for the state of Utah. And I studied molecular and cellular biology and biotechnology, mainly around large mammalian cloning and human embryonic stem cell research. Those are my two main pieces of research in my background. Currently, I am in the clean tech arena, trying to produce biological energy storage devices. And I'm interested in all things biotech, and I often do Science Friday type of lectures for lay people. And Joshua invited me to do this Google Hangout to talk to you tonight about genetic modification and how that can be good for our world and our crops and what the concerns are. And so we're going to talk about that here tonight.
All right. Thank you. That was very nicely done. Carol and I were both a little concerned about this evening because I haven't done one of these in a while, and this is Carol's first hangout. So
this is my first hangout.
So anyways, I guess like we spoke about earlier, I guess the best way to start out, Carol, is just to kind of explain. A lot of people don't even understand what GMOs actually are. So can you walk us through the basics on this?
Yeah, I think it's really important to start with a basic understanding of the biology. And a lot of times when we talk about biology, people go, "Oh my God, I haven't done biology since 7th grade. It's been 15 years. How am I going to understand this?" So I like to break it down for the lay person so that basically anybody can understand. So if you consider a cell, the best example of a cell that we have is that we can see with our eye is actually an egg. An egg is just one cell. So the shell is like the cell membrane, and the white part is like the cytoplasm, and the yellow part is like the nucleus. So sometimes people remember funny words that they remember from biology, like mitochondria or Golgi apparatus. So in the nucleus of every cell, we have all of our DNA, all of our chromosomes. So all plants and animals have DNA in every single one of their cells. It resides in the nucleus in the form of a chromosome in the nucleus of the cell. During cell division, the nucleus of the cell actually breaks down and the chromosomes exist freely in the cytoplasm as they replicate themselves and get pulled to the opposite ends of the cells before the cell actually splits in half. So they don't always exist in the nucleus, but mainly they do during the normal resting state of a cell. So when we eat plants or animals, we actually are eating hundreds and hundreds, millions of cells. Each one of those cells contains the DNA of the plant or the animal. The DNA is going to make products, and the easiest way to understand this is the way that we use those products in our body is if you're a bodybuilder, you want to eat protein, which is a product of genes, so that that protein can be broken down and used in your body to build muscles. Bodybuilders eat protein. So normally what happens in our cells is we ingest the cells of other animals and plants, and our body breaks down all those components into molecules. And at the molecular level, the DNA of the animals and the plants that we ingest gets broken down into its component pieces. So every piece of DNA will get broken down into the A's, the T's, the G's, and the C's that make up genetic code. So in our stomach, basically, DNA is actually very fragile. It's one of the first things that gets broken down by the enzymes, by the acids in our stomach, because it's a fragile molecule in all reality. And so every gene that we eat from every plant and every animal gets broken down and reused by our bodies to make our own DNA with and to make other cellular components. So we're starting basically with a basic biology lesson so that people can understand that when they eat a gene that's been modified, typically they're eating a gene from one plant that's been put into another plant, or a gene from a bacteria that's been put into a plant. And that's the same thing as if we were to eat a bite of an apple and a bite of spinach at the same time. It's the exact same thing. All the genes from the all the genes from the apple and all the genes from the spinach are going to coexist in our stomach at the same time.
Okay. All right. So basically,
questions about that explanation before we?
I'm not seeing any right now. I'm only seeing a few viewers so far, so I'm getting the feeling that people are having a hard time signing on. But I don't have any questions. That was explained very, very well. I guess.
Bring it back to the basic biology.
What's that?
So, bring it back to the basic biology.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, if you want to, we can start to talk about what an actual genetic modification of an organism consists of. And how do they do it?
Okay.
Okay. So when we talk about a genetically modified organism, that can happen many, many, many different ways. You can do it by conventional breeding. I don't know if you've ever seen a tree that has a branch on it of an orange branch, a branch of a lemon branch, and a branch of a lime all on the same tree.
No.
It's a type of genetic modification that's done through conventional breeding methods.
Okay.
So organisms have been genetically modified over time by humans for millennia. All the species we have now have been genetically modified through conventional breeding methods for our use. In plants, we've known for a long, long, long time that they actually swap their genes back and forth between each other quite readily. Bacteria do this as well. They do it through a little, what's called a plasmid, which is a little piece of DNA that can swap back and forth between plants and bacteria. So what we did was we started to take those naturally occurring methods that plants and animals swap their genes around, and we started to apply it smartly. So we started to take a gene that we specifically wanted in a plant and use that plasmid, that naturally occurring plasmid, to get that into the cells. We've also used a virus. So the thing about the way that viruses work is viruses can't actually replicate themselves. Mm-hmm. They have to hijack your cellular machinery, and they inject their own viral genome into your cell's genome. And so your cell starts producing everything that the virus needs to reproduce. That's how all viruses work. That's how the chickenpox virus works, for instance. So our bodies are actually made up of not only our DNA, but the DNA of every virus we've ever been infected by, as well as all of our lovers and all of our friends and all of our families, right? So we're a little part of every person that we've ever had a relationship with.
Yeah.
We, DNA back and forth between people continuously through viral infection. So in plants, we've actually used a naturally occurring plant virus, put a gene that we wanted to swap, and then infected plants with it. That was how some of the first genetic modifications of plants happened. Another way that we do it is by something which is similar to like a shotgun, which is where you take the gene that you want to introduce into the plant, so you purify the gene, it's just the gene, and you shoot it hundreds of times into the cells of the plant, and you hope that it goes into the nucleus, in through all those cell membranes, and right into the chromosome, where you hope that it gets incorporated. So each of those methods are useful for different types of plants that they work best with. And so then you have to consider, okay, well, what are the genes that people are actually moving around back and forth? Sometimes they're genes from other plants. So there was a case of genetically modifying orange strains to be resistant to a virus. So spinach is naturally resistant to that virus. So scientists took the gene from the spinach and put it into the oranges to make them resistant to the virus as well. So that's a case where it's a plant-to-plant transfer. Sometimes we even transfer genes among the same species of the same plant. So we take that, we take the same species, and we can take the gene and put it into a different subspecies of the same exact plant type. Other times we take genes from animals or plants and swap them. So occasionally, and I think that this is one of the things that people get the most confused about, is there are these types of genetically modified organisms that are actually transgenic organisms, where the gene that they contain came from a different organism that wasn't another plant species. It maybe came even from an animal. So the thing that people have to understand about that is genes are conserved across nature. If there's a gene in humans, like say a gene for vitamin D production, that gene is going to be 99 to 70% similar across all species, all the way down to bacteria. Because nature doesn't really reinvent the wheel, right? So the genetic code of that gene is going to be the exact same, nearly the exact same, all the way through humans, all the way through animals, all the way through plants, all the way through bacteria. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
So sometimes people think to themselves, well, you shouldn't put a gene from a fish into a tomato.
Right.
But, in reality, many species have that gene, and it's nearly 99% identical across different species.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, so now where do those answers kind of lead you in the thought about genetically modifying organisms? And I'm going to ask, I'm going to look at my social media sites to see if anybody's asking questions on social media.
Yeah, so far we're up to about 7 viewers on the main site, and I'm not seeing any questions yet. Folks, there should be an option for you to ask questions right inside the what you're watching, right on the top right-hand side of the screen. There should be a place for you to ask, so do not be shy. I guess, Carol, the first thing, listening to everything that you're explaining there, it actually puts my mind at ease for on a few things. But let's start with the basics on the questions that have sort of got parts of the political left all up in arms. And so, what is the purpose of, I know there are different reasons for different plants, but what are generally the reasons that you would genetically modify a plant?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. There are a handful of reasons that we generally accept in society that scientists have developed um, genetic modifications. So normally it's going to be either pest control, it's going to be herbicide use, it's going to be resistance to different types of stress. So say drought conditions or high salinity conditions.
Mhm.
Um, as well as shelf life has been a common modification, and plants have also been modified to produce different products for human use, like biofuels or insulin or different products. But those products tend to be purified out of the plant, not consumed whole.
Mhm.
So sometimes plants have been employed to produce vaccines, for instance. They've been transfected, which is what we call it when we put a gene into the plant, transfected with um, ways so that the plant actually will produce vaccines. So typically, if we do a genetic modification for a specific product like that, we're going to purify the product out and use it separately.
Okay.
So, for instance, um, there's two, I think, really common genetic modifications that people think of when they think of GMOs. It's usually the Bt toxin or the Roundup resistance that Monsanto developed. So those are only two types of genetic modifications. One is for pest control. So one is a protein that when different bugs eat it, it actually becomes activated in their stomach, which is a very, very high pH environment. It can't be activated inside of mammals at all. It's been extensively studied, and it's also been used for over 50 years by organic farmers. They actually use the Bt toxin. So it's a naturally occurring toxin. It's produced in bacteria. It's found throughout soil in all of the world. Organic farmers actually use it to spray it on crops, and genetic modification actually causes the plant to produce the protein inside the cells. So when the insect eats it, it becomes active in the insect's stomach and the insect dies. It's a method for insect control. That's actually helped us reduce our use of insecticide in this country and around the world by millions of pounds of insecticides. The other most common thing people think of is the Roundup resistance for different crops, such as soybean. So Roundup resistance was achieved by genetically modifying the crop so that it would be resistant to glyphosate, which is a type of weed killer. The reason why they developed that is actually because the weed killers that came before glyphosate were so toxic that they were actually causing a lot of problems. Most people know that herbicides are toxic. Obviously, they're killing the plants. That's what they're meant to do. And the new generation herbicide is glyphosate, and it's much less toxic than what was used in the 50s. And where we actually, we are actually very lucky that we have, 95% of our crops are planted with with a Roundup resistant gene in them now, because it's reduced our toxic burden in the U.S. by a lot.
Okay. All right.
So there's
Um,
other types of genetic modifications out there. Um, a lot of them have to do with viral viruses that affect plants. So papaya, for instance, was one. We almost lost the whole entire papaya farming industry in Hawaii to a viral episode. These plants were very quickly genetically engineered to be able to resist the virus, and they were able to save the papaya farming industry in Hawaii. So most of the papayas that are eaten now are genetically modified to be resistant to the virus. So that's something that has nothing to do with pesticide or herbicide. So most people never hear about that one.
right. Okay. So
But there's
really,
many other examples as well.
what's that?
There's many other examples as well, and it just kind of reminds you that every genetic modification has to be evaluated and assessed on its own, which is actually what the EPA, the FDA, and the Department of Agriculture do. So as a scientist, like say I wanted to do something malicious or malfeasant, I could easily inject a gene that could cause a lot of damage into a plant.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm
Right.
not going to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, like, say you injected a gene for some kind of, gross skin deformity to happen. I don't know why anybody would ever do that, but
But it can be done. It just doesn't happen.
so it's just,
So in a lot of ways, it's all right. Well, before I get to that question, so I understand everything that you've said along these lines, and I guess there's two things that concern me is and not being a scientist, I think it's something that we have to kind of pound home because I don't think I'm the only one that feels this way. It's very hard, even when it's broken down to the basic molecular level, to believe after what we went through with Agent Orange and PCBs and DBPs, that now all of a sudden, what companies like Monsanto are doing with the food supply of the United States is just it's completely fine. That's in the past. That's what our company used to be, and now this is fine. Especially when it seems like there's not a lot of independent testing, long-term testing on human health that's been done.
okay, so let's handle the first part of that first.
Okay.
So Monsanto is just one of the companies. There's plenty of companies, but I think Monsanto is the one that everybody thinks about. But it's also Dow and Syngenta and all the other seed companies. I think that you're right that when it comes to crops where you can apply as much herbicide as you want to them, that's kind of a scary thing, right? I mean, herbicides are toxic. How much of that are we actually ingesting when the crops when that herbicide has been applied to the crops?
Right.
So that is a problem, not just of the genetic modification. Genetic modification itself has almost nothing to do with that. So the genetic modification is for the herbicide resistance, but it's the practice of spraying the crops with the herbicide that's the worrisome part. Right. But that's only one type of genetic modification in a crop. But I do agree with you. Personally, I like to eat crops that have been grown organically, which means that I eat plenty of BT, GMO crops because those are the crops that don't get pesticide treatments.
Right.
But when it comes to the herbicide, I think that it's a tough thing to wrap your brain around that we produce so much food in this country, massive, in the Corn Belt, massive production of food, and it's all being treated with herbicides. And if it wasn't being treated with glyphosate, it would be being treated with something else. So I think that when you look at the difference between organic farming and mass-produced food, that's not something that should make people afraid of genetic modification. That's something that should make people afraid of large monoculture crop practices and, modern farming, as it were, and our need as a country to produce this much soybeans and this much corn. There is no genetically modified wheat on the market, by the way. That's why I didn't say wheat. Because,
right.
Yeah.
Now that was the genetically modified wheat actually had some issues, and the FDA stopped that. Is that correct?
So the genetic modification of the wheat itself didn't have the issues, but Monsanto decided, because of resistance from wheat growers and wheat importers, that the cost of getting through the FDA and the EPA and the Department of Agriculture. So you remember, GMOs are some of the most widely regulated and widely studied. And then actually we need to go back and answer the second part of your earlier question. They're the most widely regulated and widely studied things. So they're regulated by 3 different agencies, and that's the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Agriculture. And Monsanto, which is, they're a corporation, they're out for profits. They just decided, even though, in my opinion, we actually need genetically modified wheat, um, they decided that they weren't going to go through the hassle of getting it approved. The problem I think you're referring to is that some genetically modified wheat was found growing in Oregon many years ago in a farmer's field, and nobody knows how it got there. It could never be traced back to any lab or any person or anything, despite extensive study of that incident. And all of our wheat has been tested coming, out of the country and from our production facilities since then, and no more of the genetically modified wheat has ever been found. I think they chalked that incident up to potentially some misconduct.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so that was an unapproved, it wasn't approved for market at the time. So for it to be found in the field, obviously, I mean, I think Monsanto was actually very concerned about that. I mean, that could have ruined them as a corporation as a whole. So there was another part to your first question that we needed to back up and answer.
Yeah, my head's filling with questions now, so I'm almost forgetting where we were at there. But I I think you covered most of it as far as. Or did you get a question from?
So I think that we were going to go on to the safety. You said
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
many people are concerned about long-term studies and long-term health effects and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that everybody should know is that there have been over 2,500 independently funded studies that have been aggregated. So independently funded studies, not by the biotech corporations at all, but by governments and academic research institutions. And no one has ever found a single thing to be concerned about, whether that's allergies or whether that's about ingesting Bt toxin or whether it's the effect of putting a gene from a different organism into a different plant. Every aspect of these has been studied. In the EU, they spent over $200 million to do a 25-year longitudinal study. And every major scientific body in the world has agreed that for the crops that have been approved, you have to remember that this is for crops that have been approved, different genetic modifications, and different methodologies of modifying the genomes. No harmful or ill effect has ever been found. And there have been some studies that have been pointed to that have been actually widely discredited. So in a really rare move by the French government, they actually, and the French, 6 different French scientific bodies, there was one study a while back with rats about Bt toxin being in the blood of pregnant rats and causing cancerous tumors. And the number of rats used in the study was actually too small to draw any definitive conclusion. And the study was discredited by the French government, and it was French scientists that did it, and they were very apologetic because that study did a lot to spread a lot of fear and misinformation about something that's actually been very helpful. So, it's you have to weed through the what you read, and it can be difficult at times, which is why I think people need to be able to know where to find the studies, scientific studies, and to know at least how to read the abstracts and the conclusions for themselves.
Right.
And then also, just as with anything, I mean, you look at one day they say you shouldn't eat eggs, one day they say you should eat butter, one day they say, some study came out, you kind of have to keep up with it. It's like everything with nutrition. It's when a new study comes out, it's, how does this study impact me? A study just came out a little while ago that showed that there was no difference in cancer rates between women who eat only organic food and women that eat conventionally produced produce. So when we talk about the amount of pesticide that actually makes it into us on our fruits and vegetables, which is an entirely different topic, this recent study, which was a very good study, found that there were no differences in the rates of cancer. So it's things with nutrition. It's hard to keep up with, but it's the responsibility of people to do the reading and not just to believe any internet meme that they see.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I think I'm probably a little bit guilty of that too. This almost feels a little bit, Carol. I'm completely guilty of it.
Sure.
I have hired with major corporations in this country right now, and pretty much any time they line up with anything, I'm thinking, okay, well that's the side I don't trust. But what this issue is kind of starting to feel like to me, the more I talk to you and we break it down a little bit, is it kind of feels like there's a hysteria on the left over this issue, the way there's a hysteria on the right over climate change, where they're not paying attention to the science and they're ignoring the science and they're going with the fear and what they're hearing in their media. I've lost your sound a little bit.
We're going to start seeing the impact of that on public policy. So I think in general, people want GMOs to be labeled, which is a hard thing for any scientist to understand, because what are you going to label it that it has? That I don't want to know that something is a GMO. I want to know what the gene is and what it's being used for and why it was done. Mm-hmm. To label a food that it's genetically modified, it just doesn't seem useful to me at all.
Right. Yeah. Okay. But, you actually got a couple questions here, Carol, and it looks like it's a couple people that had a hard time getting in to the site right away. And so basically, they're asking for who do you work for, which you can answer again is for yourself. Okay. And then if it's safe, why are they fighting for the labeling of it? And I have my own theories on this, but before that.
Okay. Let's back up and take the first thing first. Who am I and who do I work for? So I'm the previous state science advisor for the state of Utah, and I have absolutely no stake whatsoever in any company that does genetic modification. I'm just a biotechnologist by training. I'm working in clean energy research and development right now, and I am doing business development for lab management. I've been a business and management consultant for scientists now for a little while, and I'm just a scientist who wants to help people understand everything about the world, not just about GMOs. I've also done Science Fridays about the effects of radiation and going through airport scanners and what is electromagnetic radiation, and should I get an X-ray at the dentist every time I go because they're always pushing it, and how does that, how do X-rays affect me? So that's probably to answer that question. And then what was the second question?
The second half of it has to do with labeling. If it's safe, and I was going to get there myself. You're seeing a trend, especially in Europe and Africa right now, of fear and banning and that type of thing. But in the States, the focus is on labeling, and why if there's nothing to worry about, what is this all just pressure on legislatures to label because of the fear that's out there, or are there some things that we need to, like you said, we all need to become more educated on this and know more about it? Is there benefit to us knowing what has been done for the food supply?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a fine line between, people can't even understand the basics of that there is DNA in every cell, in every plant, and every animal we eat. So now if you go out and start mass labeling things as being genetically modified, how are those people that don't have the education in their background, how are they going to react to every product on the shelf being labeled? And what is the benefit for the consumer transparency, especially if the label only says GMO, which, as we have talked about, doesn't actually mean anything. I mean, it's, as a consumer, that kind of transparency isn't helpful to me. I want to know what the genetic modification was,
Yeah.
and then I want to be able to read about it. Why did they do this? Is it so that more and more herbicide can be applied to the crops? Is it so that it's resistant to a virus? Is it, is it so that the crops could resist stress events like drought?
Yeah.
I mean, reducing water usage in the U.S. is a high priority, and making sure that our crops are protected against events like what we saw a couple years ago with the mass drought in the West. And that's why the researchers have done that research, and that's why it was a national priority to fund research like that, because our weather is changing, and the natural pace of conventional breeding can't keep up with it. So it is all interconnected. One of the questions is, do we really need genetic modifications? Well, in a perfect world, no. In a perfect world, we'd be controlling our climate. We would be not causing, multi-billion-dollar weather events to happen every year. Governments would function perfectly. Food would get to people. There wouldn't be whole countries that only have rice to eat. And yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, I think, we wouldn't need it, but we also wouldn't need, vaccines, or we wouldn't need, healthcare. We would be healthy. Viruses wouldn't affect us. They wouldn't affect crops.
So if you were going to be labeling something, it would almost be, from a consumer perspective, it would be more important to have foods where portions of the ingredients had been produced with massive amounts of herbicide, rather than saying that it's a GMO, because a GMO could mean so many things. Whereas the pinpoint area that I feel like you're agreeing is a concern and everybody needs to take a look at is the amount of herbicide use.
It's, if you had to push me to say anything, like what's my most hated genetic modification, I might say that, but that it's probably the Roundup resistance. But honestly, if we didn't have that, what would our options be? Small organic farmers are not going to feed the U.S.
Yeah.
And I know that we would like it to be that way, but we are a society that's based on large, big agriculture. I would love to be able to buy everything locally and not from monocultured crops, but if you consider the amount of soybean and corn that's grown that's genetically modified that just goes into the food supply for the animals that we eat, then you start to think of the magnitude of the problem. I mean, we don't just grow food in this country for us to eat. We grow it for all of our, multi-billion-dollar a year meat industry. So.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. And thank you for that question, Denise. And hopefully we answered that for you. The other questions here are pretty much along the same lines. It was people that came in late and were they've read a lot of the scare reports and all of that, so they just sort of wanted to know what your background was and where you had sort of grown up in,
Sure. Sure.
So let's see. I'm looking over. It's amazing how much of these questions we covered with the first part of what we were talking about. But
so I should say, I got into science. I became a scientist because I want to help the world, right? Yeah. That's the base behind why most of every scientist I know has gotten into science.
Right.
And I think that in general, as a society, oftentimes we use biotechnology as in our literature and in our movies and in our books to kind of explore the human nature, and a lot of times it can be used as a scary plot device. So it's something in our subconscious that both drives us to want to use technology to better the human race, but
Yeah.
that also makes us, nervous about it. And obviously, like, I'm all for regulation, right? But genetically modified organisms are regulated by our three biggest regulatory bodies in the U.S. So if we don't trust the EPA and the FDA and the Department of Agriculture to be regulating these without undue influence by corporations, we have a bigger problem we need to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. That's for sure.
And I think that, even though politicians and laws are influenced by corporations, it's much harder to influence the Department of Agriculture or the FDA or the EPA. Those regulatory bodies are designed to be able to withstand corporate influence, where sometimes our politicians aren't.
Right. Yeah. But I do think there's a fair amount of, for instance, and this is going off of our topic, but there is a bit of that problem that we need to address because, for instance, when you're talking about net neutrality right now, and the gentleman that's heading up the FCC, well, 2 years ago he was the head of the cable lobby. So I think people see things like that in certain areas of government, and they think that it's infiltrated the science sectors. And
No doubt, no doubt. And there are some things, and I'm not saying that Monsanto doesn't use lobbyists to influence whether they can make money or not. Every corporation does that, whether it's tobacco, whether it's Coca-Cola, whether, whatever it is. And in some instances, so let's think about the issue of creating insects that are actually resistant to BT crops. So I know that Monsanto has used lobbyists in the past to allow more of their crop, more of that seed to be planted. So this is kind of where public policy and the regulation of the actual genetically modified crop kind of intersect. So a lot of times farmers themselves are guilty of just flouting the rule that 50% of the crop needs to be planted with conventional crops to try to avoid this issue of creating pesticide-resistant insects. And Monsanto is probably guilty of trying to press the laws so that they can sell more of their seed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's why we really, need those regulatory bodies to come back and say, no, 50% of the crop has to be planted with conventional crops, so that it's that fine line of that regulation of our biotechnology, so that we are using less pesticide overall in our crops, and we're not producing pesticide-resistant insects.
So can you kind of go back there again, and so that there's actually, at this point, there are levels that the government is not willing to allow us to go past. You just said something about 50% of our food supply needs to be, is that organic or just non-herbicidal?
It's pesticide, the pesticide in particular.
Okay.
So, and you can check this out on Monsanto's website. They have very clearly defined regulations for how farmers need to actually plant those crops. So if you were to plant a field 100% with BT corn, that's the type of corn that would kill the insects that it feeds on, that feed on it. You would produce some insects that were resistant to that BT toxin, and those insects would breed together, and pretty soon you would have a BT crop that didn't work anymore.
Right.
50% of each and every field needs to be planted with conventional corn.
Okay.
And so what we're doing is we're not aiming to bring pesticide use to zero. We're aiming to reduce it as much as possible by planting some of the fields with BT corn.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that leads me to the next question. And again, this is just coming from articles that I've read, a lot of, concerns about lawsuits that we're hearing from organic farmers. So when you say that 50% of the field needs to be planted in conventional means. You know, you're hearing a lot of stories these days about there's farmer A on one side of the road and he's planting GMO, and you have farmer B, Mr. Halo Organic, on the other side of the road, and waking up 3 years later, and not only is his crop contaminated with the GMO genes, but that he's then getting sued by Monsanto for having that take place. And is that something that
Monsanto has? I think they have 140 lawsuits that are active right now. I have heard rumors that they would sue a farmer that was just found to be accidentally growing a crop. That has never actually played out in any court case scenario. The only court cases that have ever actually made it into the lawsuits and into the courts were where somebody purposefully saved that plant and grew another crop out of it, which is akin to, you know, you recording songs off the radio and then selling it for profit, right? It's you can't profit off of any protected item that somebody would buy.
Right.
So for farmers that are accidentally growing it where they didn't sell it and they didn't save it and they couldn't, you know, malfeasance can't be proved, there's never been anything that's gone through in the courts on that. I know that that's a common rumor though, and I know that Monsanto does have 140 some odd lawsuits active, but it's when they could prove that somebody actually took their protected, you know, intellectual property. And you have to remember that, you know, Monsanto's a corporation. They are out there to make money. They're going to protect the thing that they have spent so much money on research and developing and getting it through the regulatory process. The only thing that hasn't been protected like that was the vitamin A rice, where they developed that for humanitarian use, and they give those seeds away to third world countries for humanitarian use.
Okay. Kind of rolling off of that question, Carol. So, you know, along the same lines where we're seeing rates of extinction with mammals around the world at a higher rate than we've seen in a long, long time, just because of population spread and destruction of habitat and things like that. Are we also sort of seeing that? You know, you see a lot of people talking about these days the seed supply and the variety of seed, and are GMOs affecting that or making it so there's going to be, like, you know, 15 super varieties 50 years from now, and all of our original seeds are going to have been killed off? Is there anything to that we should be worried about?
Yeah, so that has more to do with, again, the modern style of mass agriculture rather than the genetic modification itself. Genetic modifications are extremely popular with farmers because they allow them to increase their yield, and the farmer is frankly going to make more money if he doesn't have to buy insecticide and then apply it to all of his fields, which costs fuel and you know, time and energy. So genetically modified crops are, even though they're not popular with people, with the public, they're very popular with farmers. I do think that is an issue. It's more of a society issue though than that has anything to do with the actual genetic modification itself.
Okay.
So you know, again, we need to look at ourselves as a society. Why do we need to produce so much food in mass quantities? And you know, we have an obesity epidemic. We have, you know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that you know, the seed project where they're banking the seeds of all the different varieties, you know, just in general, I think that that's an amazing idea. It's we need to do it for animals. We need to be banking tissue for species that are going extinct, so that we can bring them back one day when the technology's there, the cloning technologies. Uh, we need to do it.
Wow, that's a whole other can of worms you just opened.
I know.
I saw the smile on your face when you said the word.
Yeah, yeah. I
You
mean,
said
and the
you were
other thing,
three.
one day we're going to stop destroying our environment, and things are going to be, either we'll have burned ourselves out as a planet entirely with this climate change thing, or our pendulum will have swung back to, a more normal way of interacting with the environment. And when that happens, we're going to want to fix things
Right.
that we.
No, absolutely. I'm trying to look here, and I think that we have hit a lot of the questions that I had. And have you checked Twitter? Have we gotten any other questions from Twitter?
I think we've exhausted all the questions, and let me see. Okay, so you asked me a question if I wanted to clear up some of the greatest misconceptions that I wanted to see corrected in the debate.
Yeah.
We maybe can save that and for a few more minutes to just see if anybody has any other questions. But how do you cut through? You also asked how do you cut through the noise around this issue so that families who want to make healthy choices and informed choices can do that. And we touched on that a little bit, but I think that in general, it's very difficult for people to, we have another epidemic in this country of where people say, well, I just don't understand science.
Yes. Yep. I'm not a scientist.
I'm not a scientist. I could never understand. I could never understand that. I'm not a scientist, and that is something that I have worked passionately for here in the state of Utah, STEM education. You talk to people who get through high school, they get through college, and they've never had a science class. We have a scientifically illiterate population where people don't know, the basics about the world around them, and that's something that, again, as a society, we need to be on a course correction. And I think that, you look at 26 different states, and they have STEM action centers now where they're trying to increase their science, technology, engineering, and math education for students, and that's going to be our best way to start clearing up some of this. But yeah, you'd be amazed at the number of people I talk to that they say, you can't explain that to me. And I say, oh, I can. I can explain it to the layperson. That's what I've been doing my whole life. I used to write for a blog called Talk Nerdy to Me Lover, where I would take, these complex scientific topics and break them down in a humorous way that people can understand. And it's really important. We need a scientifically literate public. And we need more scientists in politics. We need more doctors in politics, more scientists, more of everybody instead of just these career politicians.
Fewer lawyers. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
So, starting to sum up here before we get to, families making great decisions and everything else like that, sort of the gist I'm getting, and I'm not afraid. My whole focus and my passion, as you know, goes into the environment and into climate change and energy. So I don't claim to know everything about anything. And on this issue, you've changed my mind about a lot of things tonight. And the more I've been thinking about this, the more, when you brought up obesity, and for the family that's going out there and looking for food for their kids, instead of worrying about looking for the GMO label, that GMO corn or whatever vegetable that was genetically modified is actually a hell of a lot less healthy than that processed food that you're buying for breakfast or for dessert or anything else like that. And really, the focus should be more on processed and unprocessed. I'm coming to the conclusion of rather than GMO.
Yeah, and I think that you actually do see that with many of the debates that happen that play out across the public sector. People are worried about the wrong things. It's like I worry about flying on an airplane more than I worry about driving to the airport, even though I know logically that air travel is the safest form of travel, and I am way more likely to get into an accident on the way to the airport. So yeah, I think it's, that's kind of a weird thing again about the human condition, that we worry about, sharks in the ocean and not what we're doing to our oceans, right?
No.
Not the plastic, the millions of tons of plastic that we're dumping into the Pacific Ocean every day.
Uh, well, let's see. I think I got another question here. Oh, I did, and it was someone else asking about your background. They joined late, they couldn't get in, so it was just that's what everybody is asking. And for those of you that are on here right now, I haven't I haven't sprung it on her yet, but in a few months, once she, I'll talk about in the next couple of hangouts. One of the things that Carol's working on in the green tech sector, which is what my focus is going to be. We're going to bring her back here after her project gets funded, and we're going to talk about that instead of going deep into molecular biology and finding out that all our fears are unfounded.
Yeah. So my new project. I'm going to be combining my love of molecular biology with materials science. So the project is going to be at the intersection between biology and materials science. We're seeking to do research and development for a biological supercapacitor for biological energy production and storage. So this is going to aim to reduce the use of heavy metals and all the other kind of nasty things that go into consumer electronics, and to make them a renewable, clean energy source. Particularly because consumer electronics are only getting used more and more,
Right.
and they're gaining functionality at an incredible rate. So our phones now do 20 different things. We don't just make calls on them, and
Right.
they have energy demands, and they're, you want to talk about something that's really ruining the earth. It's the
Yep.
these. So that's my new passion, and I'm going to use my molecular biology background. I've joined with a materials scientist, and yeah, so it should be good.
All right. Well, I think we had one more thing that we wanted. Did we want to add anything else to what sort of kind of wrap it up here, bring it full circle, and kind of talk about, for mom or dad, watching you after we promote this video tonight, what they could be doing, to be worrying about the safety of their food rather than focusing on the GMOs.
Yeah, so I think that to wrap it all up, I would stress again that there have been over 2,500 independently funded research studies, all on GMOs, different aspects of genetic modification. Um, these were funded through governments and through academic research, and there were reasons why these things were set as national research priorities. So the way that our research budget gets decided at the National Institute of Health and at the National Science Foundation is on, what is the national priority? What is really important for the health and safety and well-being of our country that we perform research on? And so that's what they fund. So it was over 40 years ago that they started funding research into genetically modifying crops. Um, Sorry about that.
It's a little crazy here, huh?
It's getting a little crazy here. So it's been over 40 years since we started funding this. They've been studying these for over the same amount of time, and I think that the fears about the safety of genetic modification, they're just not. I don't want to say not rational, because it's a little too like contentious of a word,
Hmm.
um, but it's equivalent most of the time to eating a bite of an apple and a bite of spinach at the same time.
Hmm.
The DNA from both of those plants are going to exist in your body at the same time. So I think that if you look at the debate around genetic modification, I think that we need to rely on the regulatory bodies that we have put into place to protect us.
Mhm.
Um, and that, in this case, there's nothing that's more regulated than GMOs.
Mhm.
And if we can't trust the EPA and the FDA and the Department of Agriculture to be taking care of us, then what does that say about us as a society?
Mhm. All right. Well, listen, Carol, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your week and doing this tonight. And I've got the next show we're doing is on the 9th of July, and it's going to be focused on the meetings coming up in New York and Paris. We're going to have
Right?
a guest from the IPCC, and I would really love to have you back after you get your business going here with the green tech.
I definitely will.
Okay.
Thank
Well,
you, and thank you to the audience for joining us tonight.
absolutely. All right, Carol, thank you very much, folks. Have a great night, and you'll be hearing more about the show coming up on the 9th, and we'll also be promoting this video on our website so you can share it and watch it again if you missed the first few minutes. So have a great night, everybody.